Hey guys, welcome to the Torg Stories Podcast, summer 2022. Today's interview is with Sarah Zurhellen, who works in the Writing Across the Curriculum office. This is the second interview in a series of conversations I'm having with people about the teaching of writing at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. In a second, Sarah will introduce herself to you all, but first, a couple sounds from some of my favorite stories from the 80s. Hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Smart takes the shot, and the Hoosiers with 3 seconds. Go ahead.
But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain and an athlete
and a basket case, a princess,
and a criminal. Does that answer your question?
I love you guys.
So I'm with Sarah Zurhellen. Why don't you tell everybody the job title and some of the main responsibilities?
Sure. So I'm the assistant director of the Writing Across the Curriculum program at Appalachian State, and I'm also a professional consultant in the Writing Center. The beginning part of my job was just a lot of outreach, a lot of talking to people around campus, and trying to get a sense of their needs, what they knew about the Writing Across the Curriculum program, what they wanted from the Writing Across the Curriculum program.
Who convinced, so it's a new position.
Yep.
Who convinced who that your position was needed?
Yep.
Where does the money come from? Do you know stuff like that?
I know some of it. So I wasn't in the room when the convincing was happening. So who convinced who, I can't quite tell you, but I can give you a little bit of genealogy maybe of the program. And actually, I think I just finished listening. I didn't get all the way to the end, but this morning I listened to like the first probably 45 minutes of your conversation with Bethany. And she used the phrase DNA. And I think that ties in really well. So the original director of the Writing Across the Curriculum program was Georgia Rhodes. And she had been a tenure track faculty in the English department. And then her work was kind of split in half. When the Writing Across the Curriculum program was formed in 2008, she kept a half-time appointment in English, and she got a half-time appointment as director of WAC. When she knew she was retiring, she made the argument that WAC should continue to be directed by somebody in a tenured position. So Beth Carroll is the director, and I mean, you should definitely talk to her. She was in the room for those conversations, so she might be able to speak to that more. But she's also the director of the Writing Center. And so the argument was made that WAC needed an assistant director because it was too much for her to do as a half-time job when she was also director of the Writing Center. And it follows the institutional structure for University College. So there's an assistant director of the Writing Center, there's a director of the CAE, there's an assistant director, they actually have an associate director too. So it kind of tracks with those institutional structures.
So the funding aspect is a little bit interesting because, for example, in the English department, in the Rhetoric and Composition program, which falls under the big umbrella of the English department, there's always talk of like how many students are being serviced. So students are sitting in the classroom and they're paying tuition. And that allows budgets and people like me to be hired. So I would imagine that's a continual challenge for WAC.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, I was thinking, I was writing my personal, so I'm full-time staff and adjunct faculty because I teach one class a year. So in my full-time staff position, I get to do a really fun performance management report for myself each year. And one of the things that they ask about are what are the challenges to your job? And of course, a huge one is that we actually have fewer resources, even though my position sort of counts as like a little bit more, but we have fewer resources than we had. And this is true for the Writing Center and for WAC than we did when WAC was started in 2008. And we have not quite twice as many students on campus, but I think there were about 14,000 students then, and now we're at 20,000. So we're serving a lot more people with fewer resources, which I think is true across the board of pretty much everyone who has a job on campus.
I wondered, before I came to App, and I just pulled that article up again this morning by Georgia and Beth supporting a vertical writing model, which you might know. I sort of wondered how since WAC was started, all the resources that were described and the work that was being done and the collaborations, I wondered if that was trending up or down or what you
I think,
say. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's just transforming, right? Like the university is changing. We're serving a lot more students. I think I know we're trying to do a much better job, for instance, of just tracking how many students we reach, right? Like, as you said, funding for jobs for faculty positions is based on FTEs, like butts in seats, right? But we are in a supporting role. And so this was part of my annual reporting for WAC this year when I was making recommendations for next year, that every time we work with a faculty member, to make sure that we are also keeping track of how many students are in the class that we're helping them with, right? Or that they're working on, because that tracks our impact, right? If we are helpful for their work in redesigning an assignment and changing the way they assess writing or something like that, then that is getting passed on to the students, right? And we kind of want to think about that. And I just wanted to add, because the other part of my job I think is really important as well, and that is as a professional consultant in the Writing Center. The Writing Center has undergraduate consultants, graduate student consultants, and professional consultants. And all of that means is that we have full-time staff positions on campus, as opposed to the students, right, who are student hires or they're graduate student assistants. It's really like a title, an HR thing. But we largely work with faculty who want to work on articles that they're publishing or books they're working on. A lot more graduate students than we used to work with, I think. And then kind of fill in for the gaps in other places. Just when we get really busy, we might end up working with a lot of other students, but that work, I think, is complementary to the WAC work, in the sense that I see a lot of faculty assignments I see a lot of faculty working on their assignments at the same time that I see a lot of students working through the assignment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So one thing that I would say, or would hope, I guess I keep circling back to talking to people about the vertical writing model, because I think what could be interesting is, like, Sarah says something different than Bethany says, which is different than what I thought. So I'm sort of looking for like intersections and gaps and things that are, so just sort of like, briefly, even though I've already kind of covered like what the vertical writing model is in my mind, how would you describe it? And then I'll see if we can find anything we might want to talk about in there.
Sure. So the vertical writing model, as you called it, is a curriculum, right? So the vertical writing, that's
so is model the wrong word? Or
no, model's not wrong. In fact, we recently had this conversation. Miles brought up, he said half of our materials say vertical writing model and half say vertical writing curriculum. And it's really interesting, I think, that you raised the question, because it wasn't taken from somewhere else. It wasn't like, oh, look at this college doing this thing. Georgia, and I know this history just from talking to her a lot about how she started WAC, she brought in a lot of people. Like NC State had some version of a WAC program for a long time. And I think Chris Anson was there at the time. She brought him in. She brought Toby Fulweiler, who I want to say was at the University of Vermont. I could be wrong. Anyway, a lot of people who had been doing WAC other places. She talked to those people when she was designing the vertical writing curriculum, but the design itself is pretty unique to App. Lots of other places have WAC programs, and a lot of them look different from each other. That's just kind of the nature. But here, that means that students take a writing intensive or intentional writing focused class, ideally every year that they're at App. Now, obviously, some students take 6 years to graduate and some take 4, but it's based on the idea that students will take a writing class their first year, their second year, their third year, and their fourth year, and that those will intentionally build on each other, right? Prior to that curricular design, there were writing designated classes, right? That was more of a horizontal approach. So the language horizontal and vertical comes from education, right? This idea that like writing, the different skills happen both horizontally and vertically. And horizontally, that was, students were selecting from a range of courses that they would get general education credit for. And a certain number of those had to be writing designated courses. But all that really meant was that students were writing in those classes. There was no oversight of what they were writing, and I think that this is a really important point, how they were learning to write. Because as I think Rec Comp faculty know better than maybe anybody else, assigning writing and teaching writing are not the same.
Right. So you make me think of two things. I mean, one thing I would say, as a member of RC faculty, I would hope that I would have some shared philosophies with you in WAC about the teaching of writing. How do we do that well? And then part of what you're doing is evangelizing that pedagogy to the rest of campus, and then facilitating conversations among myself, probably not my colleagues, the way things are going now, but facilitating conversation between myself and you out to the university, and that we're all, kind of on the same page. Will you agree with that? What's being left out in that?
I think that's 100% true. I think the relationship between WAC and RC has changed a lot over the years, just due to the nature of changes in the institution, right? And so I think that, and it can continue to transform, which is a nice thing. I see us as existing in a kind of, and I see this in a positive light, in a sort of liminal space, right? Whereas the rhetoric and composition program is housed in the English department, which is housed in the College of Arts and Sciences. We're housed in University College, which is under academic affairs, like just structurally in the institution. We're not connected to a particular disciplinary college, right? And so I do think, for me anyway, the most important and the most interesting part of this work is making those connections across those spaces, right? Because it's so easy to get siloed. I think I was a student here in 2000, from 2000 to 2005. And it was so much, it was like half the size, literally, that it is now. And the town was everything was like half the size. And so,
Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, that's just what I see. And I do see a lot of, I love the term, the idea of the evangelizing, right? Because it does feel like that's a lot of what we do, is like try to make connections between people, and try to take practices that we know are good for student writers and good for teachers who are trying to help students learn to write, to spaces where people aren't as comfortable with those ideas.
And I have very rarely come across situations where anyone's able to kind of move around in spaces, whether it's, I'll give an example of a basketball program, or a sound practice for teaching writing. You can't walk around like you know everything and you're going to tell all the people who don't know anything.
Right.
It doesn't work like that. And, there has to be, to me, when there are equal conversations, like Sarah knows stuff I don't know, and I know stuff Sarah doesn't know, and let's talk about, like, attracting people to that conversation is the way to go, but also challenging.
Yeah. And I think the interesting part, I think that the really interesting part is that we, that is kind of the foundation of writing across the curriculum as a field, right, that developed out of composition. But a lot of those original WAC scholars, when WAC was sort of forming in like the 60s, didn't have composition background. They some of them did, but a lot of them were coming from other places, but were really committed to the idea of students writing in these spaces. And we're sort of seeing how it was different, right? How students were struggling to transition from what they might have been writing in high school, if they had a first year composition class at the time, what that looked like, and then taking that into disciplinary spaces. People noticed that struggle and kind of came together to start asking questions about it. So I at least kind of really just dig the idea that we're always kind of on that periphery space of being like, well, tell me what you know, tell me what you do, tell me what challenges you have, and then let me like offer what I can from what I hear. And I don't sometimes it's also like a therapy space, although I would make a terrible therapist. I'm much better at this, but because it is a lot of listening and trying to kind of hear what people say that maybe they haven't noticed themselves because they're like in it, right? Like they're deep in it and we're sort of external. And I think, to me, that's just like a really motivating factor of the work, because I'm constantly learning about what people do in places that I maybe don't even think about writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you use the phrase intentionally build, meaning the work I do as someone who almost always teaches 2001 should intentionally build on the work of 1000, and that the writing in the discipline class should. So to me, that seems only for me personally, in the way that works is because I've taught 1000 before. I've really dug through the objectives and thought about what they mean. And I've really thought about the difference between what I did in that course and what I'm doing in this course. But I'm not intentionally build the result of very many conversations. And I'm not intentionally building the result of seeing artifacts from work from 1000. That's fairly just, if I happen to know Miles and we talk for 15 minutes about something he's doing, I mean, that would be the way it would happen. So that's what would you say about improving everyone's ability to intentionally build what the other course and faculty?
So I think I think we can do a whole lot more work there. And I think that will happen. I think that there was a lot of like rapid growth. So I think there are several prongs maybe to this, but there was a lot of rapid growth in RC, which means there are a lot of people there who for a long time, there were a lot of people there who were there when the WAC program was founded. And when that happened, there was a major change in the way that courses were taught. So there used to be 1000. And then the 2000 level writing class that students took was an introduction to writing about literature. That was changed into introduction to writing across the curriculum. And so a ton of work was done around that, right? They spent a year doing reading stuff, doing shared readings, doing workshops, faculty worked together to design syllabi. And I think one of the few people left from that is Katie Adams. So there's been major shifts there that partially have to do with like the nature of, the adjunctification of higher ed, right? And the fact that people can't make ends meet doing non-tenure track work oftentimes. And so there's like a lot of turnover in those positions. And all of this is kind of weird, like institutional nitpicking, right? But one of the reasons I think that there's a chance now for more connection is because the jobs that Jesse and Bethany do used to be one whole job, right? And so the person in that position prior to Jesse was Kim Gunther. And she was doing that job when I was rehired in 2014, when I came back to the institution. And at that time, the WAC program was offering, I don't want to say we worked more closely with Rec Comp, it was just different. But we did a lot more assessment and professional development work for the rhetoric and composition program because Kim was doing both of those jobs together and was completely overwhelmed. And those were tasks that she did not have time to do. And so that was part of the programmatic support that we offered. And it's part of the programmatic support that we offer to other departments. So if somebody, says we want to assess how students are writing in our field, we will sit down with them and do the kind of question asking that I was just talking about like, what are you looking for? What are your goals? What are your outcomes? Let's get some student artifacts and start looking through these together, and we'll help them set that up. As you know, there's a lot more expertise for that kind of work now in rhetoric and composition. I mean, I think what the rhetoric and writing studies program now has 6 or 7 tenure track faculty, several who bring assessment expertise. I think Bethany is one of them, with them into those roles. And so I think, part of what we're no longer doing is stuff that they really wanted to start doing on their own, which makes perfect sense. And now they have the resources to do that, right? Or I think are beginning to get those. we are always trying to do more assessment of the connections between the 1002, like those two courses together, and then what comes next, right?
Yeah, the thing I mean, I think about, I think there's either people who are teaching 1 and 2 courses in RC, and so they're teaching at lots of places, or there are people who maybe are teaching a 5-course overload or a 6-course overload.
Yep.
And then we get an email from you guys that's like, hey, there's this meeting,
Yeah.
Unpaid. Maybe there's a little bit of, so like I think one of the WAC things I went to, I think I got a stipend. I think it was like 2 afternoon, and I was like, okay, the semester's over and they're going to pay me a little bit. I'll go to the, so that's related to what you were saying.
Oh no, thank you so much for saying that, because I'm constantly making the argument that it is ethically wrong not to pay faculty to participate in the professional development events that we host. But of course, all that depends on our budget, which is constantly shrinking and never guaranteed.
Right. And so part of what's happening here with my project is I've looked at the boundaries within which I'm operating. And I've said, hey, Bethany, we have these things called research clusters. And I use that. And that's within the service that I have to do contractually in RC. So I'm like trying to figure out like, how can I do this work, but it also counts for some things that are in my contract that I have to do anyway. Yeah. So I think a little bit related, there's this phrase, writing studies, that's used. So Beth and Georgia used that phrase in their article as one of the 4 ways that I could do the work of teaching RC 2001. It's also, I have also written at a different institution a proposal for a minor in interdisciplinary writing studies. And then we have this new, I wish I could describe it more clearly. I should be able to, given the questions I've asked so far. But somehow professional writing has kind of merged in the English department into this. What are we calling that? Not a program. What are we calling the writing studies?
Is it rhetoric? I thought it was rhetoric and writing studies program.
That's the program I'm in, which is under the big umbrella of English. I shouldn't be asking you. I should know. And I know Bethany probably already tried to explain that to me last time. But anyway, so to me, that term is used a lot, writing studies. And I think its meanings are different depending on who you ask. Does that phrase mean anything to you? Does that concern you? Is it not really something that you cross?
I guess for starters, it doesn't concern me wholesale. I think that sometimes I am concerned. Let me think about how I want to phrase this.
Once you hit that record button and
I know.
It's going to be
No, it's not that. I don't want to get it wrong. Right. And
right. You're guessing from your perspective.
Right. Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And let me just for the record, since this is being recorded. So my background, and in fact, my PhD is in literary studies. And I actually, when I first came back to App, was teaching sort of half composition courses and half literature courses. And my way into WAC was sideways because
I think everyone's way is sideways.
Right.
Almost everyone's way.
Yeah. But so my research was about how the history of computing, the rhetorical work that was done in the history of computing, how that impacted metaphors of the human in fiction. Right, in the 20th century. So not WAC work, except that I was doing a lot of reading and rhetorics of science, right? And how do we rhetorically analyze science writing? And what kinds of cultural impacts does that have? And all of that is to say that gave me some level of confidence when I started doing WAC work to at least talk to people in the sciences. Not that I know what they're doing, because I have no idea, but I do have some familiarity with their writing. But what that also meant was that I wanted to gain a lot more expertise in composition history, right? And so part of what I'm saying I don't want to mess up is that history, but composition as a field has always struggled with this idea of it being viewed as a service, like a sort of cottage industry, right? It's over here servicing students who then go on and later take these very difficult, rigorous, serious disciplinary classes, and composition isn't treated that way. So part of the language shift, I think, is in response to that. It's to say, no, actually, we're not just teaching students how to write. It's also something people can study, right? Writing can also be an object of study, and writing studies as a term represents that in a way that the word composition does not. So there's a disciplinary history there in terms of why we use certain words in certain contexts. And I sometimes worry about that because I feel like it deprofessionalizes the role that composition continues to play in academic spaces. So that's like an aside piece there.
Yep.
My other thing, though, is that there's a whole shift in like the pedagogical turn in like the writing about writing movement, right? That textbook is a huge example of that, but people hold workshops on it. I think that there's a special interest group at 4Cs for it. It became kind of like an offshoot or a movement in its own right. As a pedagogical approach to introducing students to the idea, again, that composition is more than just composing prose, right? That it's something we can also study, that we can have methodologies for, and those kinds of things. So that's kind of what I have to say about those pieces.
Yep. I think here's a different way into the same topic. From where you sit, what would you hope that I'm doing in my course, or what would be some things that you would say about that? I mean, I'm not like trying to, I'm not trying to like trap you into saying something and say, I'm not doing that. I think that would be a way for us to talk about this. Like,
So I would really hope that, and maybe, so I'm going to answer it kind of sideways, which is like,
and I think a different question would be like, if you taught one of these classes, what would be some of the major features of that class? That might be less, a different way to ask it, where you're not like.
No, and I guess I think about this in terms of what do I want students to leave the class knowing or thinking?
Yep.
Is kind of how I'm rephrasing it for myself. And that, because I think there are lots of ways to get at the same thing, right? So what the major project is less interesting to me than what is the student takeaway from those major projects.
Right, absolutely.
So I would say, like, I would like students to understand the concept of discourse community and start to be able to think about how they situate themselves within that concept in different spaces. I would like for students to understand genre as something socially constructed that they participate in when they're writing. And maybe not in those terms, right? Like those might not be the words that they use to talk about it. And I would like them, and I think this actually starts in 1000 and continues hopefully on for the rest of their lives, but that like language has power. And that's why we take care when we're using language to communicate, which is different than using language to learn. And I keep using the word language here because I think that, and this can get confusing with both writing, the term writing, and the word composition, but like what writing looks like looks very different in different spaces, right? So for computer scientists, a lot of times writing is coding, right? For mathematicians, it might be proofs. It's not always writing an essay or making an infographic or writing a blog post, or, like even the things that we really try to get students to push those boundaries against, like to start thinking about their social media posts as writing and those types of things. It gets even more diverse than that when you get into disciplinary spaces. And my goal always when I was teaching 2001 was that students would leave my class recognizing that all those things constituted, whatever you wanted to call it, writing, composition, whatever they wanted to name it, those were language practices. And when you're using language practices, you have to be aware of the impact that they're having external to the space where you're using them, right? And that counts whether you're writing computer code or writing an article for the Washington Post.
It seems crazy to me that you really landed on like two of the exact phrases that I use. And I don't know how, like, to me, I would have said I almost always have to build a community first.
Mm-hmm.
And that's super connected to the idea of audience,
Mm-hmm.
because I think students are often writing with no thought. They've
Mm-hmm.
never encountered a real audience.
Mm-hmm.
They've encountered teachers who glance at their paper and write -24
Yeah.
and move on. And
Mm-hmm.
there's no like trying to get thoughts in your head sort of. So there's that. But then the very next thing I would say is introducing the idea of a discourse,
Mm-hmm.
so that good writing in science is different than good writing for a teacher constructing a digital portfolio
Mm-hmm.
in relation to a band who's trying to get people to come to their event using
Yeah.
social media, or to even brand a local business,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. And then next would be like the thing I can do is introduce people to the idea that a text is something that does work for groups of people with common goals.
Yep.
And we're going to call those genres. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not like a horror genre, and that's not creative writing as a genre. It's a whole new way to
Mm-hmm.
define
Yep.
genre. And then that we try to identify these genres in all those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you and I are kind of operating, if we were symbolic of WAC and
Mhm.
RC
Yeah.
and WID, we would be in pretty good shape on where we're starting. But I feel like how in the world did you and I end up on those same two things? I mean, I don't know. You and I haven't talked about this really.
Right. I mean, I don't know, but I do. I mean, when you started like at App, I'm imagining one of the things you did was just look at people's syllabi, probably read the website. And those ideas are fundamental to WAC pedagogy, but then there are some others, right? So God, I'm not going to remember the last names. Anyway, the idea of threshold concepts, and I'm terrible with names. Anyway,
I mean, I think one thing that seems to be true is that, or at least in the writing about writing textbook,
mm-hmm.
that I don't know that very many people have used,
Mm-hmm.
but like when that came out, I was so excited that like, yeah, I can claim this and I can do this class this way. And this seems like meaningful work. I'm not wasting my students' time when they walk in and we're doing this, and I can immediately convince them that this is not a waste of their time. It sounds like maybe a lot of the concepts in that textbook. Do you know that textbook well?
Yeah. When I started when I started at Appalachian State, that was one of the 3 textbooks that faculty were choosing from to use, and most of them were using Writing About Writing. Okay. So there was a time when that was a very popular textbook that was being used, and I loved it for all of the same reasons that you just named. I also think that one of the things that was really helpful to me in what you just said is thinking about like my favorite thing about teaching 2001 actually was the idea that it was a lot of sophomores coming in their minds thinking, why do I have to take another gen ed writing class? I took this other writing class. Isn't that enough? And sort of watching that transformation as they grew to realize how sort of foundational the ideas that they learned in 2001 were, and how much they impacted their future. So just the number of students who used that course as a way to think through not only writing, but how knowledge is conceived, how it's created, how it's shared in their field of study, because I shouldn't say none, most of them have never had the opportunity to think about that. And to be fair, very few disciplines teach that in their disciplinary courses, right? They're teaching content. Very rarely are they teaching like the big picture philosophy of this discipline, right? Or the ethics of knowledge in this discipline. And 2001 is sometimes like a real opportunity for students to start exploring that in ways that I think are really interesting. So there's pieces, we talk about writing a lot, but there's a literacy to it that has more than just writing, right? It's how do people conduct research? What counts as research? And all of those, what counts as evidence.
I think that the idea of literacy takes us well beyond words on a page, right? Like, so if we just think about like super elementary digital literacies, changing the settings on my Google Doc, so I can gauge who's seeing it, and like a lot, students will come in not knowing those things. Or if we think about whitewater rafting, for example, there's a whole bunch of literacies, equipment, tying of ropes, safety. There's all these literacies I don't have. And so I am not a member of that discourse community. I mean, I bring it up because I was sort of on my way and stopped once. Or mountain biking. I tell the kids sometimes, that the students, who aren't all kids, who probably don't want me to refer to them as kids, that when I'm sitting at the top of a mountain on my mountain bike and encounter groups of what I would call fluent members of the mountain biking community, they know I'm not fluent immediately. They just look at me and I say three things and they're like, oh, this guy, he doesn't know.
No, right before we met, I was using basketball as an example in the office next door, because I was like, oh, I'm about to do this interview, and she was like, oh, who's that? And I said, he knows more about basketball than I think anybody I've ever personally talked to. It's just one of our first conversations. Like, I think we went to get a beer and we're talking about basketball, and I love basketball. I played basketball. I love college basketball. And you started talking and I was like, oh, I do not have this level of expertise, right? Like, I immediately knew, like, nope, I can't talk about basketball at that level.
I was kind of remembering that conversation, and I was like, Sarah and I we maybe could start with the NBA finals and just start talking about that first. No, I was thinking about how, like, I don't know, was that 3 years ago? It was, it was like, we met at Boone Tavern and had a great conversation, and you were in the middle, I think, getting ready to defend dissertation. Yep. And then there was a pandemic, and now this is like the next time that we're talking. Yep. I was like, because you were one of the first, I talked to Bethany first because she's going to be on leave, and I knew I had to get her in or I would miss her. Yep. And then you were one of the first people I thought of, and I was like, I kind of think of Sarah and I as friends, but we really haven't talked in 3 years. So I don't know if she thinks of me like that.
No, I mean, you're great. Like, I got your email. I was like, oh, this is an awesome project. I'm so glad someone's doing this, and that you can do it as part of your, like, that counts for service. I think is fantastic. But also, it's just nice to talk to you, because I was like, yeah, we met once. I defended my dissertation. A pandemic happened. I had a baby. So, I was on maternity leave for part of the pandemic.
I thought you had a baby, and I was trying to figure out if you did. And I was looking through emails, like, where's the birth announcement? And I couldn't find it. I found Miles's birth announcements, because, every time I search for your name, I get, that you come up in many emails because you're always included in the same emails as me. Yeah. So I think we have a whole different podcast about, like, well, it would have been I think we can do it now. It would have been jarring to ask you because we were on a roll early. So was there a point where, like, you wanted to write post-apocalyptic novels? Did you have like a phase you were never going to do that? Were you going to be a literary critic? What was sort of like, where were you heading with all that?
That's fast. That's a good question.
Because me, I went basketball, divorce, I wrote this like novel. Really, it was a memoir, but I didn't really know enough to call it a memoir. I called it a novel, and there was enough things that were different that it was okay. And then I was like, oh, this stinks. I need to talk to other people about how to do this. Yeah. So that was like my way. And then I ended up sitting in a room with all these writers or people who had PhDs in composition. And I did that for 11 years and got this education on doing this job. Right. So I was just wondering, like, your way in, what the goals were, or maybe there was no plan, how did you get to this?
I think it was like half plan and half accident. So I'm originally from East Tennessee, and I started college at Rhodes College in Memphis. I really, really did not fit in there. I was one of the few one of the few kids from a public high school. And somebody my chemistry teacher in high school was an Appalachian State graduate, of all people. And he used to talk about how awesome it was. And so
so you went to high school in East Tennessee?
I went to high school in East Tennessee. And when I was a freshman in college, I was looking for places to transfer to. And I remembered these awesome stories about App State. And my mom drove me up here one weekend to visit, and I filled out an application like as soon as I got back to my dorm room. So I transferred here I absolutely loved it. It was, I mean, like college is a life-altering experience for people, right? I guess if it goes well or poorly, but for me, it went well, and it was very much a life-altering experience.
And at that point, were you an English major because you loved to read and wanted to teach high school English, or what?
So no,
What
I
you
was a journalism. I was a
Okay,
communications major with a journalism like specialty or whatever, and an English major just for fun. I wanted to be like an embedded war journalist. I wanted to travel the world and go to dangerous places and interview people and write exposés and
So I want to interrupt you right there to say that to me, that's writing studies.
Mhm.
That's like the path that's hard to take in the siloed universities. Like
Mhm.
you have these interests, you
Mhm.
don't want to go deep into 300-year-old literature. You're interested in like communicate, all that. Anyway, go ahead, keep going.
Well, I realized, so for one thing, I'm really, really bad at learning languages. Like I really, really struggle. I have to just be immersed for a long time. And yeah, it just became clear to me that like that career path was not very realistic for a whole lot of reasons, but that was one of the strongest ones. Anyway, and I also had this degree in English because I took a bunch of literature classes because I thought they were interesting. I mean, I really struggled. Luckily I went to college when they didn't limit the number of credit hours you could take. So I took between 18 and 22 credit hours every semester I was a student. Just because everything sounded interesting. Like I've always been just a generalist, right? Everything sounds interesting to me. There's not enough lifetimes to like do all the stuff. And then I stayed for my master's because literally Bruce Dick at the time, who's still in the English department, I think,
Right. Yep.
was the graduate director. And I was in a class with him and he came up to me one day and said, have you ever thought about applying to graduate school? And I said, I don't know what graduate school is. So I did not come from an academic family. I didn't know what that was. I jokingly told my parents I'm going to go to graduate school because they say you should do what you're good at. And I'm good at school. Like I'm good at being a student. So I went to graduate school. I got an assistantship teaching. I used to throw up before every class because I was horribly shy. I had really bad social anxiety. I would break out in hives and vomit. It was just gross. And somehow I survived it. And then I left and moved around. I lived in Oregon and Indiana and Kentucky, and was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I was trying to decide if I wanted to go to law school or get a PhD. And I worked at several law firms. And no lie, this is going to sound so immature, but it is very real. I decided that I wanted to get a PhD instead of going to law school because I did not like dressing up for work every day.
Yeah.
And I kept remembering Bruce, who always wore flip-flops to class. And I was like, if I'm a professor, I can wear flip-flops to work when I want to. Both of them would give me the opportunity to do what I really like to do, which is to learn about stuff. I mean, they're like to continue learning, right? That a huge part of my job would always be learning something new and not just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So I applied to PhD programs. I ended up at the University of Missouri for a whole host of silly reasons that don't really matter.
You went there. Did you move there and live there? And
I lived there for I lived there for 4 years. I left for a while. I had some like family tragedies and I left for a while and did other things and was not a student. I was ABD for like 9 years.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah. So, and then I finished my dissertation in 2008.
Yeah, I think that's a good story for people to hear. Just even like me saying, I really didn't have the word memoir as something that was in my head that I could do, just because we were just starting into the discourse. And I remember my MFA program not really knowing what to do with me when I was like, I want to take these 3 classes. They're like, you don't need them. And they were like trying to decide, do we have to charge him for this? Or are we going to let him take these classes? What can we do with? So right.
Oh, I mean, it was a struggle for me to get people on board, even with my dissertation idea, which ultimately it went really well and people were really excited about it and thought it was great once it was written. But trying to, like, I was really interested in physics and math and how those were really kind of the frameworks from which computing was developed, and trying to like get people in English departments to think that matters.
Yeah.
But like, so there's science is a very, very, this is not something that I want the writing and the disciplines people to hear me say, but science is like a very metaphorical space. In order to translate scientific ideas into something that the average human can visualize and see and have some kind of concept, we use so many metaphors. And to me, like that is where like my background in English studies or communication studies or whatever, like marries with my interest, just in how people use language, like in all spaces, because the hard sciences are treated as, literally we call them they used to be called the hard sciences, right? Versus the social sciences. We use so many metaphors to try to understand our world.
Let's do one more thing here. So we've gone pretty deep into 2001. Mm-hmm. So if we were going to look back to 1000, mm-hmm. and you were going to say something about from 1000 to 2001, that feels like pretty familiar territory to me, but still touch on it. But then I think looking ahead, like to the writing in the disciplines class, how do you build on 2001 from that? So look back from 2001 and look ahead from 2001.
Yeah. So I think looking back, I don't want to say too much because honestly, like that really is within the purview of the RC program, right? Like how you all see those classes connected is more important than how I see them connected. And I think that that's an important idea to maintain. Yeah. But I think at least traditionally, and I always taught 2001, I've only taught 1000 a couple of times, although obviously I've taught similar classes at other institutions as well, that like 1000 is doing so much introduction to college work, right? It's doing so much. I don't necessarily want to say breaking the bad habits of high school, because not everybody comes in with the same habits, but it is a lot about creating a level playing field, right? About helping everybody get to a shared understanding of what writing they're capable of. And I don't want to say but what is it? One of the things we talk about in the writing center a lot, right, is that like good writing is good writing to whoever that audience is, right? Good writing is counts as good writing is different for different people. And one of the things that I think 1000 can be really good for, at least in my experience of teaching it, is helping students gain confidence that they can figure out what that is in the spaces that they're in, right? So it's a lot about confidence building for students, understanding that when they're struggling to write something, it's because they're struggling through thinking about something, and that's okay. That oftentimes, writing requires revision, right? Writing requires other readers. Those types of ideas, I feel like, are things that a lot of students don't come in knowing. And I hope that 1000 is introducing them to those ideas. And I want to just keep the word introducing in there, because it's so easy to forget for students and for faculty that like these classes are introductions to ideas, right? The idea is that they keep practicing. It's not, there's a reason it's called Introduction to Writing Across the Curriculum.
I think a couple things I would say about that, adding to, is like expanding the idea of what it means to write. Because writing is so often like 45 minutes, maybe by hand on a piece of paper or typing into a computer, a box, and then it's over. And then that a social media post or a YouTube post, that's not writing. They would never even thinking of that as writing, or blending links and images and video, embedded video. So there's just no thought that even is writing. Yeah. So it's expanding that idea. And then also some students do come liking to write, but not many. Right. And just sort of showing that like when you have some choice about the project, that there can be a lot more good energy in it. And in those students who are pretty adept at writing literary criticism, they need, and that's 10%. They need to start thinking about writing as something else, because they're going to be asked to do things very differently as they move through their courses at App and into the workplace. So I would say that about that. Yeah. And then looking ahead now to the writing and the discipline classes.
Yeah. So looking ahead, I always, what I wanted my students to understand when they left 2001, which we'd already talked about, was that writing was different in these different spaces, but that I wanted them to have the tools to approach a new piece of writing, whether they were writing it or reading it. And I like want to emphasize that because I read very few scholarly articles as an undergraduate student. Now the expectation is that students are reading some students are reading scholarly articles as first year students, right? Like they're being asked to really engage with a level of language and disciplinary expertise that was not the case in my undergraduate education. I don't know if that's generational, like maybe it was happening other places and just not here. I don't know. But I think that what I want students to what transfers from 2001 to the WID classes most of the time, obviously not all the time, is the ability to like look at a new assignment or look at a new reading or a new composition scenario or situation and start to take it apart and understand its pieces, right? Understand, and one of the ways I think, what is that textbook that's called Introduction to Academic Writing, maybe, I forget what it's called. They broke it down and talked about structure and language and reference. And I always found those like really useful features to help students like take apart a text and understand it. And so I think a lot of the, like what you were saying earlier about discourse, communities, and genre knowledge, taking that into their WID class helps them translate. I'm going to use the term translate, which I'm totally taking from Laura Gonzalez, and I do know her name, so I'm going to use it here, and be able to translate what their WID instructors are asking them to do. Now, obviously in WAC, we work with a lot of WID and capstone instructors to assist with that. Like we talk to them about, when you are asking students to reflect on something, or when you're asking them to write an abstract, or when you're asking them to summarize, it's worth acknowledging that what those verbs mean in different spaces is different. So if you can give examples, right? If you can talk through how you define that term, and also talk to students about their previous experiences with that term. What kinds of reflection have you done in the past? What kinds of summaries have you written? Like those sort of moves in the classroom can really help students transfer, if we want to use that term, what they've learned in one space. And remember, like, oh, I did learn how to do this in 2001. And maybe it's been 2 semesters since I took that class, so I don't recall everything, but we did actually talk about, what abstracts look like, right? Or in these different places.
Yeah, two things that I do here to pick up on the word translate. For example, there's a genre of news story journalism that is research finds blah blah blah. So it's 400 words about the impact of waking up and looking at Instagram every single morning. The first thing that you do, that's what you do. So that's to me a nice bridge assignment, which is like I read this article and it was a huge stretch for me. Yep. And it is probably a little too big of a stretch, but I'm going to translate that into an 800-word news story as if it appears in the Times or on the NPR website. Yep. And that's what it's going to look like. So we do that, which I think at least gets them like looking at the whole section, so that hopefully when they go to the WID class, they're like, okay, I have thought pretty hard about how this thing is put together. Yeah. And then they write a discourse report. And I'm pretty specific on like, you are going to have a lit survey, and you're going to have to establish what we mean when we say discourse. And I'm giving you a lot of that literature now, and someday you might have to come up with that literature on your own. I mean, you're going to be the one who's going to find, so to me, those are two like little bridge assignments into the WID course.
And I think those are great. And one of my constant refrains is that everyone has one semester. The students have their whole like career here as students, right? And so it's I think there's always an unreasonable expectation on all teachers to somehow like teach everything in one semester. So like if those are the two things that students are doing that help prepare them for their writing in the disciplines class, that's excellent, right? I would look at that and say like, that's outstanding. If they take those two ideas into their writing in the disciplines class, that's incredibly helpful for their work in that writing in the disciplines class, right? And the same thing for the writing in the disciplines class. We don't call it Introduction to Writing in the Disciplines, but the way we call Introduction to Writing across the curriculum, but it is, right, for most students. And I also think it is worth acknowledging, because I recently had this conversation with several disciplinary faculty. Writing in the disciplines doesn't always mean writing academic language in the disciplines either, right? There are plenty of disciplines who are very interested in their students learning how to write for public audiences, right? Learning how to represent themselves in professional pieces of writing that aren't scholarly articles. And so I think like that is actually an enormous shift, I think, that has happened over the past 10 to 20 years that we're paying more and more attention to in the WAC program. And I hear the same language from RC, right? That this idea, not just that students recognize that as writing, but that we're not only considering academic writing when we're talking about writing in higher education, right? Because we are trying to prepare students to write in lots of spaces, and most of them are not going to be writing in academic spaces.
No, you still, because I was thinking, you still have the student who's a junior, who's most focused on the job that they're going to have.
Yeah.
Not writing for the journals
right.
of their major. And I was trying to think, I mean, there's some bad examples, but all the writing that a teacher is going to have to do, communicating with parents, managing a grade book,
right.
Creating interesting assignments on a learning management system. That's like, I guess I probably, even though I think there's a touch of, I just gave some examples of how we're looking at scholarly journals, I really have in my mind the students talking to people who do things like own a small business and talking about the genres that do work for them.
Well, and so part of that, and we'll go back to that term literacy for a minute, because a huge part of that, and I talked to my students a lot about this in 2001 actually, is you may not, for nurses, for instance, once you become a nurse, you do very little day-to-day writing. You do a lot of chart keeping, right? Like you're keeping charts, you're entering information. Precision is incredibly important, but a lot of the like summarizing work you do is verbal, right? It's summarizing something when you're talking to the next shift change person. It's equally as important, right? But it's verbal, it's not necessarily written down. However, regardless of the work that you're doing, whether you're a small business owner or a nurse or, whatever, being able to find the information that you need to stay current in whatever work you're doing and understand whether it's legitimate, whether it's crazy, whether it's intentionally manipulative, like whatever the, thing is, that is a critical skill that I think students learn as they're like going through this disciplinary journey. And so like I said, to go back to earlier when I was talking about, like, it's not just how people write in a field, it's how they create knowledge, right? So if you're a small business owner and you need to write a business plan, or you want to be a small business owner and you need to write a business plan, how do you find out what a business plan looks like? How do you find out what information you need to include in it? Nobody taught you how to do that in college. I don't actually think that it's necessarily like the responsibility of a college to teach business majors how to do that. I think it's the responsibility of a college, at least in our vertical writing curriculum, to help students learn how they find that information and use it as a model for themselves in the future. Same thing for nurses, if they start working in a new area and they need to like catch up a little bit, maybe on some stuff that they learned 20 years ago, where do you go for that information? And are you capable of reading it and understanding it? Have you stayed current in your understanding of the research in your field, of the knowledge in your field?
I think that what could happen is somebody's going to arrive to something like a new position, and they're going to be like, crap, I'm failing. I don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
There could be a little moment when they're like, wait, Torg told me this would happen. This is a new discourse for me.
Right.
Of course I'm going to struggle.
Yeah.
I need to find people to help me.
Yep.
I need to start looking at these. Either it's like a presentation I have to give every week, or it's something on a piece of paper. And there's a little bit of knowledge of like, oh yeah, this was supposed to happen and I can eventually succeed
Right.
Even though there was nothing that told me how to do these things, I
Mhm.
at least know enough to go ask some smart people, fluent members of the discourse,
Right.
questions about what I might do here. To me, that's the thing that might happen.
And well, and I love how you describe that, because Sarah Beth and I are actually collaborating on a research project that's looking at, so most of the writing in the disciplines classes are taught in the students' majors, but as you know, there are writing in the disciplines classes taught in the English department, and some of those are taught for other majors. So the professional and technical writing course, there's a professional and technical writing course that is taught for students who are professional and technical writing majors. There's a technical writing course that is taught for computer science majors. And there's a business writing course that is the writing in the disciplines class that's taken by about half of the students in the business college. So that's a lot of actually WID work that is happening within the rhetoric and writing studies program. And so what Sarah Beth and I are interested in is, how are students transferring, or are they transferring knowledge from those earlier writing classes that they've taken into their WID class, and from their WID class into their capstone, and what does that look like? And also, what do the faculty who teach those classes, how do they think about that transfer, right? And so we've really just gotten started. I'd be happy, we've only written one little short thing about it, but we did focus groups with 3 classes last semester and interviews with 2 faculty, and just, like I said, just kind of started coding, and that was just in the English department and computer science. But it was really interesting to start seeing some of the questions. I did the focus groups with the students, and some of the questions I asked were about, what do you do when you encounter a task and you don't know how to complete a writing task, and you don't know how to complete it?
Nice.
Right. And it was really interesting, because the students, I talked to Sarah Beth's capstone students, and because we wanted to start with the capstone and work backwards. And most of them at that point were either in their internship or they'd done it the previous semester. And they were talking about how in their internships that happened, right? So one of them, I'm not going to remember all of them, but one of them, part of her role in her internship was to draft grant materials. And she had never written a grant before, right? So she talked to people who had written grants before. She went on federal websites and read about grant writing. She talked to the people, she looked up our grants office and talked to those people. She did exactly what you're describing, essentially. But she also talked about how having taken her writing in the disciplines class, they'd been introduced to the idea of grant writing. She just hadn't chosen that as the thing that she worked on in that course. And so she felt more prepared to identify who those people were, right? Rather than, because I think one of the things that happens sometimes with discourse communities and literacy is that if you don't even know enough, you have to have a certain level of knowledge already to be able to identify who those experts are, right? If you're such an amateur, people could just tell you anything and you would be like, oh, well, this person seemed authoritative and therefore I'm going to, take their advice, and maybe they were completely wrong. And of course, the internet is full of that, right? So being able to look at a website and say, oh, this website is giving valid and useful information versus this one that is not.
Right. I don't feel good about my ability to get students to correctly cite information in each discipline they might enter. But I do feel good about my ability for them to walk out and go, okay, this is a different college. I should ask someone about citation method for
but that's exactly, I think that is precisely the hope at the end of 2001, that they know to do exactly what you just said.
Right.
Yeah.
So I got 2 more questions for you. One is, would there be I don't know if WID faculty is the right way to put it. Would there be people who are teaching the WID classes that you would have me talk to? Could you give me a couple names, or is that something? Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. So I could give you a ton of names. There are a lot of people doing great things in writing in the disciplines classes. Now, there are hundreds of writing in the disciplines classes, and I don't know what's happening.
So I'm sort of asking, who might be willing to let me record a Zoom interview with, if you come across people who would be game for that, do you think?
I think Mark Kissel, who's in anthropology, is, I know he's really interested in teaching the Wit and Capstone courses and has like a real commitment to writing to learn, right? To have like students writing to learn. Ann Ward is in communication, and both of these people teach the writing and the disciplines courses. I think she has a really interesting perspective because she started teaching it during the pandemic. So she's kind of had to continuously transform. Ellen Lamont is in sociology. And she, I know, also just thinks that writing is really critical in the work that her students do, and has spent a lot of time kind of struggling through like how to help them.
That's probably a good start.
Okay.
And you can add to that by email if you want. So a little bit of shift here for the end. Take your pick. So either Boone favorites, you've been here a while, just things like you like to do or eat, or something that might be interesting. Or another avenue would be like some sort of content recommendation, whether it's a book that you love or a Netflix series you've been watching. So that's sort of just a more fun ending.
Yeah, more fun. So I'll do, I guess I'll do Boone favorites. I feel like, I don't know, I'm really into sci-fi. I don't know that that's really interesting to people. No. But so Boone favorites, it's summertime. So I love music in the park in Valley Cruces on Fridays evenings. I think that's really fun. Food.
Sarah, I live 1 mile from the park.
Yeah.
And I have never been to the Friday night music.
Oh my God, it's so much fun. It's so much fun.
Right.
Oh, so much fun. You have to go.
There you go. See, I'm going to take your food.
What?
I'll take your recommendation.
Yeah. Oh, it's so much fun. You can take your own food and drinks. They have food trucks there. It's a great community. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Do you live over this way or no?
No, I live in Meat Camp, which is out towards Todd.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I was going to say in Todd. So I spent a lot of time in the summertime kayaking in a relaxing manner, not whitewater, which I have done in the past, and hiking. And I live really close to Elk Knob. Some people hate Elk Knob, but it's a beautiful hike. And I think I've done it so much that I forget how difficult it is sometimes. But I recently tried to hike it with a 20-pound baby on my back and was reminded of how difficult it can be when you have so little extra weight on you. So, and I love all the trails off the parkway. I mean, I spend a lot of time on trails. Good. Fort Trail is a great one. I don't know.
Yeah. Good recommendations.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for talking to me today.
Yeah. Thanks. Phil. It was great to see you.
Good to see you.
Get to see you more in the future.
Yeah. I think we've got a whole nother hour, off to the side, unrelated to the vertical writing model.
Okay. Nice. Sounds good.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Phil. Bye.